Chapter 28 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 28. The days grew longer and longer, but there was a little life on the banks again. Now and then a boat would come in with 400 or 500 fish, quite extra wealth. So it was going to be a record year after all, despite its having been so uneven on the whole. There were now good times for the peddlers too, and even Jakob had bought himself a blue duffel coat and a gold ring for his own finger. Lars was sitting reading in the hut in the evening. It was history this time, and a book of that sort is a wonderful thing. You open it and begin to read, and all at once the hut is gone and you are among emperors and kings, indeed among people who died many 100 years ago. You are with an army on an expedition into Asia. You see the French king's head cut off and fall into the street, where Tom, Dick and Harry play ball with it. Strange times. And the fisher boy was taking part in it all, while the other inmates of the hut sat mending their nets. Once or twice he raised his head and looked at them as if from a great distance. His father was sitting up by the wall with a number of nets that had to be mended. A little help would not come amiss, but Lars was far away in other kingdoms and lands in fine company, and thinking of becoming a fine gentleman himself. Every book he read took him farther and farther away. What Kristofer thought about it he did not say, for it did not concern anyone else. "Shall I help you, father?" "Oh, no. There is no more than I can manage myself." The boy knew it was pride that made his father say this, and he was on the point of rising to go and help him, but the book held him. He would read only a few more pages, and the hut vanished, and once more he was far away in other lands and other times. Later in the evening he raised his head once more and came down to earth with eyes that could see his comrades in the hut. Was he going to become like them? He thought. It was not that he thought himself too good, for his father and grandfather and all the others were good enough. That was not the reason. But an ambitious lad who became a fisherman had no paradise before him toward which he was travelling. Even if he should one day become a headman, what was that, after all? The headman toiled through a life in poverty like the other men in his boat. He was the slave whom tradesmen and banks, middlemen and merchants, here and abroad, sent out to bring the fish ashore to them. The banks and the tradesmen became rich, the middlemen and the merchants became rich, the station king was rich, but there was one who was poor all his life, and that was the fisherman. Would Lars go in for that? He tried to read again, but now it was a different history. It was not about kings and wars and revolutions. No, it was the story of his own class through hundreds and thousands of years. An army of millions of weather-beaten men passed before him. They had drawn riches from the sea to make others wealthy. They capsized and were never heard of again. They became lepers and suffered a living death in some hut. They dragged through an old age, crippled with rheumatism, after the long years of hardship on the sea. A good year like the present one was a streak of silver in their grey life. The fisherman bought himself a ring and lived for some days in a bower of roses, but then came the 7 lean years and the same distress in the grey cottages along the grey coast. This was what the boy saw. These bearded men now sitting in the hut had once been young like himself, but it would be impossible now for them to sit as he was doing, dreaming of swinging himself up into a better position. It was too late for them, but there was still time for himself. The book was his salvation. It would be goodbye to Cornelis, Lars thought to himself. They would not long be comrades after all. Once more he lost himself in other times and other countries, while the netting shuttles danced about him. During these days Jakob limped about, so rich and important that he did not know what to do. If his wealth had amounted to only half what it was, he would have bought a few barrels of the most expensive brandy and treated the whole station, but this was too much. He lost sight of land, his head was confused enough already, and to drink now, impossible. He went out on the sea every day like the others, it was not that. He stood cleaning fish with his men as long as there was a fish left to open, and so he was not proud. But when a man is padded all round with banknotes, he has not much peace, either day or night. So this was what it was to be a rich man. Yes, but the aggravating part of it was that he felt just the same as before. His short leg had not become any longer. He looked just the same when he saw his reflection in the water. He could not eat more than his fill, and if anyone were to come and offer him expensive flowers with his bread instead of cheese, he was quite able to pay for them, but would they taste nice? As soon as they came in from the sea and had finished with the fish, he began to adorn himself. He washed himself and shaved his upper lip, and treated himself to new underclothing from the shop, and last of all put on his blue duffel coat and his ring, and there he was. Then he stood still and tried to feel whether this was what it was like to be a rich man. He now began to limp about and display himself with a beaming face and twinkling brown eyes, and was in a glorious state of confusion. Brandy! Oh yes, it can brighten the world right enough, but the thought of all one could buy if one only had money enough also makes one see suns and moons and sing. Oh dear Maria! Oh ho! There was that big newly painted galleass now. Oh no, he might just as well take a three-master. Perhaps he would be able to buy one like that, and then people would be obliged to call him captain. He would just like to see them looking down on Jacob. Or should it be a large fish wharf like the station king's? People would have to call him a trader then, or indeed a merchant. But what about leaving the Sea-Flower? No. But there was something else he might do. He could gild her stem and stern and buy a silk sail. He hummed to himself as he limped about and continually saw new visions. Oh dear Maria! Oh ho! One night he decided that he would build a fine house down in the south, and it should not be painted in the ordinary way, but tattooed like a seaman's hand. And then he would hire 2 or 3 people to stand on the beach and welcome him when he stepped ashore from his Lofoten voyages. One morning a thought struck him. Now that he had become a rich man, he ought surely to associate with his equals. He accordingly dressed himself in his duffel coat, put his ring on his finger, and set out. This time he entered the office of the station king himself. The gentleman with the red beardless face and yellow eyes was writing at his desk, and looked up. No fishermen were allowed in the office. Everything was settled out in the shop. What did the fellow want? Jacob began to fidget with his southwester, to screw up his eyes and make himself irresistible as he had done to the commander. Oh, he only wanted to look in, he said, and hear how the other was. The gentleman behind the desk opened his mouth, stared, and put his pen behind his ear. And then he wanted to know, Jacob went on, fidgeting still more with his southwester, whether the station owner would do him a service. It was a strange thing that when one was prosperous, one liked to show oneself in a different light. Well, the fact was he was sufficiently well off to think of giving a party, or a ball, as they called it. He had hired the whole of the hotel and all the food and drink that it contained, and now he wanted to know if the station owner would condescend to be one of the party, and perhaps his lady too. He had intended to ask the doctor and the priest and the commander, and he thought that in the future there should be more friendliness and intercourse between those who owned a little more than the spoon with which they ate. Not a muscle of the station king's face moved. At last he said, "Isn't your name Jacob?" Yes, it was, Jacob Ossan. Very well. You were the guarantor for nets and clothes sold to a Hitterøy man last year. Yes, Jacob remembered that. The man was drowned, said the station king, beginning to turn over the leaves of the register. Yes, God have mercy on him. He was drowned last spring. and he left next to nothing, and his debt is not paid. Your share of it as guarantor is 119 kroner and 50 øre. Will you pay it at once?" "Yes, certainly." And Jacob took out his pocketbook and began counting it out. "Sørensen," called the station owner, and a man came in from the shop. "Just attend to this man, will you? He wants something or other in the shop. Good morning, Mr. Jacob Aasan." Later in the evening the old man was standing in the darkness outside the station owner's white house, looking at the long row of illuminated windows. He shook his head. How strange it was that no matter how much money a little man had, it was of no earthly use. The big man would only let him in just far enough to get hold of his money, and then he would chuck him out again. Jacob revenged himself that evening, however. He went to the priest's house, and taking off his southwester, he knocked at the door, opened it and entered, turning round on his long leg as he did so. "Why, it's Jacob!" exclaimed the priest, who was sitting in a rocking chair reading a newspaper. On this occasion Jacob was humble. He only wanted a little information. How much had the station owner given to the mission? The priest pushed his spectacles up onto his forehead and looked at Jacob. "What did you say? What in the world do you want to know that for?" "Well, because I thought of giving twice as much." The priest gazed at him in blank astonishment. "If it's the seaman's mission you mean, of course all contributions are thankfully received. How much can you spare, Jacob?" "Twice as much as the station owner." I can't help laughing, but what if he hasn't given a farthing? "Then I'd better give for him as well," said Jacob, producing 2 large notes. The priest did not take them at once, and Jacob stood holding them out. At last he said, "Now, my good friend, I can take that money, but in that case I shall put it into the savings bank for you certainly can't afford to give all that. I know you fishermen. You can't bear to have any money in your pockets because you're not used to it. But tell me now, how much have you made during the last few weeks?" Jacob shook his head. He did not keep accounts. He had not counted up his gains, but he owned a few things, several fully equipped boats, and he was not short of cash either. "Well, thank you," said the priest, taking the money, and Jacob said "Good night," and went out of the room. He put his head in again, however, and added, "Perhaps you'd be good enough to give my respects to the station owner and say that I've paid something into the mission for him." "Good night, Jacob." When Jacob was gone, the priest placed the notes in an envelope on which he wrote, "The property of Jacob Aasan," and put it in a drawer in his writing table. The day might come when they would be useful to have back. Jacob made his way among the huts in the darkness, humming to himself as he went. Every day is wonderful to a rich man. Today he had put the station owner himself to shame. That was something to have done. Oh, dear Maria, oh ho. He met Cornelis Godmoen, and together they went into a bar. Cornelis called for coffee, and Jacob did the same. There was no question of brandy in times such as these. Jacob liked talking to this lad. They called for cigars and talked and laughed until the room rang with their laughter. Jacob had once been young like this young fellow, and he was also from a small mountain farm. He remembered distinctly what it was like to herd sheep and goats. It was a long time ago. Once he had been on the point of marrying into a big farm. He was not lame then. Oh, no. But at the last moment she took someone else. Yes. She was still living, but it was years since he had seen her last. How the time passes! But it was jolly to sail south every time to the place where she lived. But then one day, well, there was an end to it all. He might as well own, however, that she was not exactly rich. It was as much as she could do to make ends meet, what with rates and debt and a duffer of a husband. Jacob had thought not once but 100 times of sending her a banknote or 2 or 3. He had been in a few record fishing years, and could have paid all her debts, but he never got farther than to the steps of the post office. He never managed to send the money off. Suppose she refused to accept it and sent it back again? She was a proud woman. But beautiful 50 years ago. Ah me, you should have seen her. And Jakob's brown eyes grew soft as velvet with the recollection of summer and youthful days. Brandy warms the body, but prosperity makes the heart blossom. That evening Jakob felt he must have someone to confide in, and still more, someone to do good to. "And what about you, Cornelis? Aren't you going to get married soon?" Cornelis pushed his cap back from his forehead and laughed. "I've been thinking of it," he said. He too had a few things to talk to a comrade about. He would first of all have to cultivate their land before he could bring a woman to the farm. And the buildings would have to be done up. He would paint the house yellow and the cowshed red. But it was the money. He had made a little this year, but then there was all he owed. To tell the truth, it was not easy. Jakob asked him if he might lend him $100. Cornelis shook his head. He owed enough already. "Will you take the money as a little present?" Cornelis shook his head again. He was not going to beg if he could help it. His eyes flashed almost angrily beneath his knitted brows. At this Jakob brought down his fist upon the table, making the cups and saucers dance. "Confound the fellow! Do you think I'm not rich enough to pay for the whole of your rubbishing farm and give you $100 into the bargain? Huh? Do you think I'm a church mouse? Do you think I'm a beggar? Huh? Have you got 5 boats with all their nets and other things? How much money have you got about you? You miserable fellow, you! Upon my word, it seems impossible to get rid of a single penny tonight." For a little while they sat and sulked, each smoking in silence and looking straight before him. But then Jakob's face brightened, and he turned to his companion. It was impossible for him to be anything but good-natured this evening. He had now taken it into his head that he would be like a father to Cornelis and help him on, so that he could marry and paint his house and bring the farm into a good state of cultivation. He approached him more cautiously, in order to avoid the risk of having a fist planted between his eyes. In a carefully worded sentence, he asked Cornelis whether he would be able to take him in as a lodger when the time came that he was no longer able to go to sea. A little attic or something like that, as big as a Lofoten boat cabin. That would be more than good enough. "Oh, yes," said Cornelis. He could promise him that. He could manage that. "Yes, but what'll the rent be?" "There won't be any rent, so you needn't talk about it. We'll talk about it when the time comes." Jakob meant to have the matter settled on the spot, and he would pay the rent now, while he remembered it. How could he tell whether he would have any money when the time came? What was paid was paid. It was money saved, and he would know that he had a roof over his head. "Here's 500 kroner, and if you don't take them, then damn it all, you're a fool and an idiot, and I swear it too." Cornelis looked at the notes and thought of the farm and of his old white-haired father. There would be new times at Gomorn. He accepted the money and pushed it into his breast pocket, saying as he did so, "Oh, Jakob, Jakob." Cornelis had meant to go out on a spree tonight, but he could not go now. There would be changed times now for him too. While they still sat, some fishermen came in. They were the head men on the 4 boats that Jakob had bought before the good fishing began in the fjord. "There's the king," exclaimed one of them. "It's you we're looking for, Jakob. You'll have a drink, won't you?" Jakob shook his head and smiled. He did not want a drink, but he quite understood what the men wanted, and when they sat down at the same table and began to talk about all kinds of things, he smiled again. Did they imagine that he did not see through them? They first wanted to make him drunk, and then buy their boats back for a mere nothing. Well, perhaps Jakob was as great a fool as you take him for. Try, and then you'll see. In another moment they approached the subject. They wanted to know whether he did not think it would be reasonable if they bought their boats and nets back again. That transaction had really been almost what might be called a joke. Could they not talk it over? Oh dear, yes, by all means talk it over. And the price? That, they supposed, would be the same that he had paid. Just so. Jacob thought so too, so they were agreed as to the price. But then about the money. They would have to ask to be allowed to let the debt stand over in the meantime, for what little they had earned while working for him they had already sent home. Jacob smiled once more. The men had talked it over, he could see, among themselves. But he was not a hard bargainer. Stand over? Of course they could let it stand over. He knew perfectly well that he would never see a penny of these men's money, but he waved his hand grandly. Was he a rich man or was he not? The station king would never have done such a thing, but this was Jacob, not the station king. When he went home that evening he was quite sober. There was a new moon again, and he could see the rows and rows of fish hanging on the lines to dry. Was Jacob drunk? No, but he was excited. His wealth had begun to dwindle, but what of that? He had 4 boats less than before, but what of that? Had he not still the sea flower and banknotes all over his body? 4 boats given away, a room hired and paid for up at Godmoen, and a small fortune given to the mission. This was what it was to be a rich man. Oh, dear Maria, oh ho. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 29. There was a usual swarm of boats lying over the banks, hauling in lines and nets. The air was raw and foggy, and there was a light swell. "There is good fishing today," Peter Jusansa shouted across to the seal, and Kristaver agreed with him. The nets were full of cod, and there would be thousands in the boat if they went on as they had begun. "The air is awfully still," cried a Nordlander, looking all round. There is a certain kind of stillness that makes the fisherman listen, and when one headman assumes a listening attitude, it is taken up in boat after boat, until all are trying, as it were, to find the scent. In fog, every sound is suspicious, and now the cold sea mist began to move and drift in a southeasterly direction, and that meant wind. Listen! Already there was a strange roar. "We shall be having a visitor," shouted a Nordland man as he hauled and hauled at his nets to get them in time. They must make for land at once. "Hurry up, men!" shouted Peter Jusansa. In all the boats the men were working their hardest, hauling for their very lives. They knew this roar that was growing louder and louder, and their energy and their anxiety spread from boat to boat over miles and miles of sea. "Make haste! A storm is coming!" This time it came so quickly that there was hardly time to do anything before the boats were in the midst of it, tossing up and down upon huge foaming billows. It was impossible to draw in the nets. The boats would only have been swamped. Knives were pulled from their sheaths and the nets cut off, the long chains of nets with all their burden of fish disappearing in the foaming water. The next moment a little sail was hoisted. Would it be possible to tack in toward land? The boat was driven along over waves like rolling mountains. The sail disappeared into a deep valley, and a new wave appeared to be breaking over the very top of the mast, but the next moment the little boat again mounted into view. The men on board were drenched to the skin and bailed for their lives. They all knew that in such a storm it was impossible to tack toward land. The only hope of safety was in sailing away before the wind and wave, at haphazard over the sea, as far as God willed. They ran before the wind, but the boats lay deep in the water with the weight of several hundred fish, so that the waves broke over the stern and made it useless to bail. The headman shouted an order that was repeated in shouts forward, and 3 men fell upon the fish and threw the precious cargo overboard, as if they were sacrificing to the sea to save their lives. Even now, when everyone had enough to do in looking after himself, comrade boats tried to keep in touch with one another. Peter Susansa on the Seafire saw in front of him the Seal's brown sail, now high on the crest of a wave, then descending into a deep valley. Would it appear again? Yes, there it was. It grew dark, and the sky was all black scudding clouds. The wind whirled the spray into the air, where it tore about like wild white wraiths, and the little sails were scattered and driven like storm-lashed birds in an ever wilder and wilder flight. Where were they going? No one knew. When would they be able to turn? No one knew. Sometime tonight or sometime tomorrow they would perhaps be shattered upon a rocky cliff on the mainland. Perhaps the wind would drive them seaward for days. Perhaps in another moment their boat would capsize, and then there would be nothing more. It was the first time Kristofer had sailed the Seal close reefed. The sail was now as small as it could be, and did not reach halfway up the mast, and yet it was too large. It would be wrong to say that Kristofer was enjoying himself, but at last he was out with his boat in downright earnest. And how would it end? He had a huge pocketbook in his breast pocket, and was responsible for 4 other lives on board. In cautious steering, the miscalculation of a wave, half a second in which his eyes were not everywhere, and the next moment they might be clinging to the keel of a capsized boat. It was not this, however, which occupied him most. It was the boat. She had capsized 3 winters in succession, but it was impossible to discover wherein the fault lay. There was some hidden cause which he would perhaps be able to extract from her now. As he stood in the drenching spray and the darkness, with his whole being intent upon the management of the boat, he felt that something was wanting in his mastery of her, and that at any moment she might play him a trick. The trough of that wave, for instance. If the stern were to be lifted so high that the rudder for 1 second hovered in the air, the boat would broach to, and then where would they be? Take care, take care. There it was again, something wanting, insecurity in the rigging and boat. Confound it! He clenched his teeth. It was as though he and the boat were wrestling for the mastery. Lars stood by the mast, minding the Priar. This was important now that they were scudding before the gale. His southwester was pulled down over his ears and tied under his chin to prevent it flying away, and his eyes were fixed on his father. Every word that the headman shouted might mean life or death. "Slack the Priar!" his father shouted. "Slack the Priar!" all the men repeated, and Lars hung on to the rope and carried out the order, and then once more fixed his eyes on his father, standing with the tiller in his hand, his face intent, his eyes everywhere. When a wave tossed the stern into the air, the headman seemed to be flying heavenward. Then they rode with the crest of the wave under the middle of the boat, and the water all round them was lashed into greenish-white foam, making it seem quite light on board. Then the stern sank again, and his father with it into the depths, and Lars was on the point of shouting, "Are you coming up again, father?" But there he stood, just as calmly, at the tiller, ready to meet a new mountain of water. And now he rose again, and Lars felt as if he had got his father back once more. The boy began to repeat hymns, for all good spirits must help his father tonight, and if things went wrong, he was with his father at any rate, and if they ever got to land he would never leave him, never do anything to displease him. They sailed on, they knew not whither. Whether it was to be right across the west fjord or out into the ocean or straight upon a rock, God alone knew. Even if they had had a compass on board, it would have been impossible to see it, and to strike a match in this weather. Now and then they heard cries that were not from birds but from human beings clinging to the keel of an upturned boat. It could not be helped. Tonight everyone had to do the best he could for himself, and those who still sailed knew that numbers of capsized boats were floating on the sea for miles round, and that those who clung to their keels must go on crying for help, for no one could heed them. They sailed on and on. Darker it could not be, but it could get rougher. They could no longer distinguish between clouds and sea. The very heavens seemed to be falling upon them in white foam. No, it was a gigantic wave, and the wind broke the crest of it and sent the spoondrift flying about like white wraiths. Would the boat clear it? She did, but was almost swamped, and the men bailed and bailed until the next wave came. They sailed on, but it seemed to Lars that they were no longer on the sea, but flying through a weird dark region in which foaming billows pursued them like green and white hobgoblins. They howled and tried to reach them, twisting and turning in a wild death dance, flinging themselves upon the boat, from behind, from above, from the side, coming suddenly out of the depths to dance round her with foam-flecked faces all round, everywhere. And his father stood on the thwart and was still keeping them off. How long would he be able to manage it? This was a long night. The waves kept dashing over Kristofer, sometimes nearly knocking him down, but he nevertheless began to feel pleasure in his boat. She yielded so plainly to the waves and cleared the most incredible billows, and every time he would have liked to pat her, as one would a good horse, and cry, "Well done, Seal!" Was it possible for the wind to be worse? Great chasms seemed to be rent in the raging sky, and out of them darted fire, and the long yellow stormy gleams threw weird reflections over the seething waters. When the boat rose on the crest of a billow and was borne along at its dizzy pace, it was almost as if she rose out of the water and flew through the air, as if even the keel lost touch with the water, with that on which the boat must keep a firm hold, and it was at such a moment that the Seal first dived down into the trough of a wave, then broached to and capsized. The waves dashed over her, but now she was floating bottom upward. There were cries from 5 men as she turned over. They were drowned in the roar of the wind and the waves, and that seemed to be the end. But no, 2 men were already hanging to the shrouds. The sea tossed the boat along, and 2 more who had been under her came up and held on to the shroud on the other side. Where was the 5th? Mechanically and half stunned, the 4 men dragged themselves upon the boat, sitting astride over the keel to which they clung, so as not to be washed away. They had swallowed sea water and had been battered by the waves and the boat, and they had lost their gloves and southwesters. Kristofer had a feeling that Lars had come up, but he could not help crying out, "Are you there, Lars?" "Yes, father," came the answer. "Hold tight." "Yes, father." One man was missing, however, but Kristofer caught sight of a boot that was flung against the side of the boat and managed to get hold of it, though he almost fell off into the water in doing so. It was Cornelis that he pulled up, and the man must have received a blow against the boat, for he was unconscious and made no attempt to hold on. No thought of letting go of him crossed Kristofer's mind. He would just have to cling with one hand to the keel, although it was as much as the others could do to hold on with both hands. A capsized boat on the Lofoten Sea is an ordinary thing, and they knew it. They were swept along, now high on the crest of a wave, now deep in the trough. It was an ordinary thing to be drowned on a night such as this, and they knew it, but they nevertheless held on tight because every second was a second more to live, and they cried wild, agonizing cries for help, and the cry was the same from them all. "Lord God, Help! Help!" Every new wave that came foaming toward them was perhaps death itself, and involuntarily they crouched down before it to diminish the force of the blow. They cried again, though they knew there was no possibility of rescue. They cried in an agony of fear that stifled reason. They cried like animals that feel the piercing knife. Their cries rose above the roaring sound of the wind, but no one answered. The waves broke over them incessantly as they sat, flinging them hither and thither in the darkness. After a time, Christopher recollected that the boat would lie more quietly if he could cut the shrouds on one side, so that the mast could float up. "Lay hold here!" he shouted to Henry Rabben as he pushed Cornelis over to him. Henry gripped his unconscious comrade and held him fast. "Catch hold of my boot!" Christopher shouted to Arnt Åsan, who instantly let go his hold of the keel with one hand and grasped the headman's foot. Christopher then drew his knife from its sheath and let himself slip down over the side of the boat, and as a wave washed over his head, he heard Lars cry, "Oh, father, take care!" He soon came up again, however, with his knife between his teeth. The shrouds were severed, and in another moment the mast shot up from beneath the boat. But he had made a serious mistake. He had cut the shrouds on the lee side, and the mast came up on the weather side and was immediately carried toward them on the top of a wave. If it hit any of them, it would be certain death. It might sweep all 5 of them off at one stroke. No, it struck the boat with a resounding blow, and then retired to gather strength upon a new wave. "Catch hold of my leg again!" cried Christopher, and once more hung head downward in the waves and cut through the shrouds on the other side too. The mast was now free. It was driven once more against the boat, but without hitting anyone, then retired again, carried away upon the waves with one end sticking up into the air, and finally disappeared from sight in the spray. The boat tossed less now, and the 4 men sat holding the 5th between them. Until now they had not known that they were drenched to the skin, and so perished with cold that their teeth chattered. They had not felt that the flying spray so blinded them that they could hardly see one another. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 30. How long they had been tossing about thus they did not know, when they thought they heard a shout in the darkness. They shouted back and shrieked for help, and in the stormy yellow light that shone upon the foaming wave crests, they saw something, not a capsized boat, but a tiny sail, a boat coming toward them. They were saved. They cried again like men begging for their lives. The stormy light shone more strongly upon them, and in its yellow glow the boat flew past. It was Peter Susansa. He had meant to save them, and they could see him standing at the helm, only a few yards off. He shouted, but in such a sea his boat would be dashed to pieces against theirs, and the old man knew it, and could only leave them there and go on. But as he left his comrades to their fate, he turned his head and looked at them, and a cry escaped from his lips, a cry that was taken up by all his men, as if they were begging for forgiveness because they could only save their own lives. Those on the upturned boat understood, and gave an answering cry of pain and anguish, and in another moment Peter Susansa and his boat had disappeared into the night. Christopher and his men still clung to their boat, as if hope were not entirely gone. Cornelis was still unconscious, and Christopher held him as before, but would he be able to do so much longer? The others had 2 hands to hold on with when the waves dashed over them, but Christopher had only one, and Cornelis was heavy. Leave go of him? No! But what if he let himself be washed away? "Cornelis," he called into the unconscious man's ear. "Try to wake up. Try to hold on. I can't keep up any longer." But Cornelis, who was such a strong lad and as elastic as an India rubber ball, was now unconscious and unable to move a finger, and Kristofer felt that it would soon be all over with himself too. Here came a gigantic wave, and he would not be able to hold on himself and hold Cornelis up too. God forgive him if he had to leave go of the lad. The wave dashed over them, and Kristofer bent before it, and when it had passed, he still sat holding Cornelis. He saw in fancy his father, the half-blind old man living in the little farm up on the mountain, and he still kept hold of the boy. They would have to be washed away together. The water beat noisily under the boat, which lay high because it was full of air. Kristofer would have taken his knife and bored a hole in it to let the air out, but he had no hand to spare, and was not equal to anything more. The same black masses of cloud were racing across the sky. The same gleams of stormy light broke from them over the sea, showing how high the spoondrift flew. But was that not another shout? Yes! There was a sail again. It was coming toward them, making straight for them. They shouted aloud, and in the yellow light they recognized the Sea Flower. She passed close by them. Jakob was at the helm, and he saw what Peter Sansa had seen, that it was impossible to heave to and help them, and as he flew on he was followed by a cry, a despairing cry. Was he too going to leave them? But that was not Jakob's thought. It would not be like Damn it all with a limp to leave a comrade in the lurch. He and the Sea Flower had been out before on a winter's night, and they knew one another. They could venture what others would never dare to do. He roared an order that was repeated forward along the boat. They got the tack down and she heeled over in the wind. The headman put her bow so as half to meet the waves and started off as if about to tack. It was madness in such weather, but then it was Jakob who did it. He was not quite sure what he really intended himself. He only meant to take a turn and keep on a level with the other boat, for he would not sail away from a comrade. The boat was filled by the waves breaking over the waterboard, but the men kept on bailing. Then they went about again, and Jakob knew that in the meantime the capsized boat must have drifted a good deal to leeward. He set his course at haphazard, and then, in the streak of yellow light, caught sight of a dark line upon the crest of a wave. There they were! The Sea Flower bore down toward them, and Jakob could hear their cries. They must have seen him and taken heart again, and as he once more steered close by them, he shouted, "Hold tight, boys, and wait a little." Such words of encouragement in the storm from one who was still sailing his own boat made them feel half saved and gave them strength to hold on. Jakob sailed away again into the blinding spray and darkness, but he had told them to sit and hold tight. Once more the Sea Flower was forced up into the wind to gather impetus for a fresh effort to reach the other boat. She threatened to fill again, and the men bailed their hardest, and Jakob steered farther and farther to windward. No one but he would have done such a thing in a storm like this, and once more he went about and began to make straight for the capsized boat, which had again been driven farther to leeward. "Keep a lookout for them!" he shouted, and the men along the boat repeated, "Keep a lookout for them!" The Sea Flower shipped more seas over her waterboard, and her rigging and sail moaned under the pressure of the wind. But was not that the boat on the top of a wave down there? No, it was gone again. A man standing by the tack shouted, "There!" and pointed with his hand. "There!" shouted the others, pointing in the same direction. Jakob stamped upon the thwart and said, "Damn it all," for he thought it was time to put an end to all this. He knew not what he meant to do, and he bore straight down upon the black line that stood out upon a wave far away to leeward. 2 men on each side and haul them in, he shouted. 2 men on each side and haul them in, the men repeated as they placed themselves in readiness. It was a mad order, but at sea orders have to be obeyed. The 5th man remained by the tack to give the headman the direction. At this moment, Jacob had no thought for the risk he was taking. He knew perfectly well that there were 99 chances out of 100 that he would lose his steerage, and then they would all be lost, but he had no time to consider this. The upturned boat rose into view again, and he was dashing down toward it on a gigantic billow. "Stand by!" he shouted. "Stand by!" the men repeated. And the next moment the Sea-Flower rode in the foam and the spray right over the keel of the Seal. "Get hold of them!" The Sea-Flower trembled as she scraped over the keel of the other boat, but the men on both sides each hauled in his man. It was like getting big fish into the boat. It was done in half a second, and they were once more scudding through waves and blinding spray in the darkness. The first thing Jacob was aware of was that his helm was not gone. The Sea-Flower was as obedient as ever. The next thing he saw was that 4 men had been saved from the shipwrecked boat, and he heard them cry, "Oh God! Oh God!" And then again, "Oh God!" But this was not the time to go forward and pity them and say, "Poor fellows!" The steering, the wind, and the waves gave him enough to do. He only shouted to his men, "Are they all alive?" And as usual at sea, the men repeated the headman's words, "Are they all alive?" "Yes," said a voice from the middle of the boat. "Yes," they all repeated. They ran before the wind again, flying on through the darkness, over mountains and into valleys, in a whirling tumult of white, shrieking spectres, sailing they knew not whither. Toward morning they saw right before them a beacon light. It was on the mainland, but how far north or how far south, Jacob could not tell. They were flying in toward a rocky coast that they did not know. At any moment they might run upon a rock that stood up out of the water or lay hidden below the surface of the sea, but nevertheless they had to go on sailing. The wind shifted round to the north, and they sailed down along the coast. They could hear the roar of breakers upon the shore side, and every now and then a gleam of stormy light showed them mountains covered with snow, and the white surf of waves breaking over rocks. Now, however, the wind had so far fallen that Jacob took it into his head to sail in the direction he himself wished. He had no thought of making for land. The tack was put forward, and he set out at haphazard through the darkness across the West Fjord again. This time it would be a long way to Lofoten. The 4 shipwrecked men lay in a half unconscious state in the middle of the boat. But surely there should have been 5? Jacob would have to ask about that when the time came. It was perhaps a little cold for them lying there with the water dashing over them, but they would be able to get warm some other time. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 31. Such things happen every year in the north of Norway, and for a day or two afterward the men talked about it, and then they go out on the same sea and begin fishing again. The shop was full of men, all talking at once. Some of them had been on their way landward when the storm broke, and had got in safely. Others had been brought in by the lifeboat, but some had only just come in after having been out in the storm all night. One small fair man in a yellow southwester was talking louder than all the others, and people were looking at him in surprise. Quite by chance he had been on shore the day before, and the boat he belonged to had gone down with all hands on board. It was evident that it had been so ordained, and that he was not meant to be with them that day. God's ways were wonderful. It was calm today, but cold. Men were standing out on the islands watching for the boats that had not yet come in. The chief inspector had sent steamers out to look for any that had capsized. A great number of boats from fishing stations many miles away had come in during the night, and they were now setting sail for their own stations in good weather. Later in the day, a steamer had come across a strange boat in the middle of the West Fjord. It was a Nordland boat, and her sail was close reefed, although there was little wind. The steamer hove to, and found that the head man at the helm was half dead, and that the other 3 men who were sitting and holding on to the thwart were frozen to death. Spray had turned to ice in their hair and beards and upon their clothes, and they were staring straight before them with wide open glassy eyes. Peter Susansa that night had come safely into Hamarøy, and it was with a heavy heart that he now sailed back across the West Fjord. He did not know how many men he knew might have been drowned, and he could not bear to think of Kristoffer Myran and his men. It was evening when he reached the station with its harbour lights, and he could see the hut, their Lofoten home, and thought how there would be plenty of room there now. As he tramped up the slippery wharf steps, he saw people near, but did not dare to ask any questions. The coming in of every boat that day was an event, and Peter, too, was soon surrounded by an inquisitive crowd, but he spoke to no one, and went straight to the hut. When he opened the door, he paused. Was he dreaming? There were men lying asleep in the bunks. He stared in astonishment, and then turned to the men following him. "Great God!" was all he said. Dripping clothes were hanging round the stove, and sea boots lay upon the floor in pools of water. The men came in and stood gazing at the sleepers. They had themselves been within an ace of going down, and they were drenched to the skin and thoroughly worn out, but all that was nothing compared with the fact that the crew of the Seal were lying in their bunks asleep. They did not count them, and in a little while Peter told one of his men to make haste and change, and then make some hot food ready. It was hardly likely that they had had anything to eat, those men in the bunks. While they were busy taking off their clothes and emptying the water out of their sea boots, Kristoffer woke, and raising himself on his elbow, rubbed his eyes. Perhaps he was confused with some dream, but then he caught sight of Peter, who the night before had sailed past and left him clinging to his wrecked boat, and for a brief moment the 2 headmen looked at one another. Then Kristoffer yawned and passed his hand across his forehead. "Have you got back?" he asked, in a matter-of-fact tone of voice. It was a little while before Peter answered. "Yes," he said, "and you've got back too, I see." "We came in a little while ago," said Kristoffer, rubbing his eyes. Peter busied himself with changing into dry clothes. He dared not ask how the others had been saved. Suddenly Kristoffer swung his feet over the edge of the bunk, and when he had found his wooden shoes, clamped over to the stove, and taking down a homespun coat from a peg, pulled a big pocketbook out of an inside pocket. "Bet you anything my money is all gone to pap," he said. "Money?" "Yes, I expect it is." The hands of all involuntarily sought their breast pockets. It is wonderful how dry a leather pocketbook can keep inside when it is tied up with a strong cord, but it was another matter with the men of the Seal, who had had the waves washing right over them last night. Kristoffer went to the table and lighted the lamp. It was customary for the headman to keep the earnings of the whole boat until the fishing ended. There were thousands of kroner this time, and now perhaps all the notes were ruined. Beads of perspiration stood on his forehead, and his fingers trembled as he unfastened the wet book. The others sat looking on, and felt it was best not to speak to him. Inside, too, the book was black with the wet, and there were the notes. They had been red and blue, now they were all stuck together in a sodden mass. "Oh," murmured the others. A headman does not generally exhibit his pocketbook, and even when two crews occupy the same hut, the one does not know exactly what the other has made, and Kristover now frowned because the others sat looking on. "Try and dry them first," said Peter Sonsa. But Kristover did not hear him and began separating the notes. It was almost like saving lives. Some of them tore, and it hurt him as much as if his own flesh was being torn. This money was what he and his men had to live on, and with which to keep their homes together. It is one thing to lose nets and boat and to know that banks and tradesmen demand payment all the same, but if the banknotes are ruined, his home will be sold by auction, and he and his will no longer have a roof over their heads. The table began to be covered with little piles of sodden paper. "We must dry them," said Peter Sonsa, wading barefooted to the stove, which he replenished, and removing the clothes. "The clothes can dry another time," he said, "but the money is the first thing to be thought of now." And he began to fasten up lines of string round the stove to hang the notes upon. Kristover sat staring at these scraps of paper. His hand lay upon the table, and he felt inclined to sweep them all together and throw them away. "Come on," said Peter, and the others began to help. The notes were carefully hung upon the lines, either singly or sticking together, and looked like tiny dolls' clothes hung out to dry. Kristover stood looking on, and suddenly broke into a strange laugh, and began to talk about there being many kinds of drying. There was hay drying and clothes drying and sheep drying, but now there was money drying. He hung over them, watching them carefully, putting more wood into the stove, and turning the wetter side of the notes toward the heat, his face screwed up all the time from sheer anxiety, as if he were tending little children. The notes became dry. He had saved them. They crackled when he folded them, but that did not make them any less serviceable for the payment of debts. When supper was ready, the sleepers were roused, but when all were seated around the table, it struck Peter Sonsa that one of their company was missing. He looked at the others, but could not bring himself to ask. The crew of the Seal looked as if they had a common misfortune, and Kristover scarcely lifted his eyes from his plate. They all ate plentifully of the fresh fish, their one thought being to go to bed and sleep. It was only when they had almost finished that one of Peter's men exclaimed, "But what's become of Cornelis Gomon?" Every one looked up, but no one spoke. At last Kristover answered. "Cornelis? Yes," he said. He didn't come back with us. No." There was silence in the hut. The men looked at one another, but not a word was spoken. No one asked anything more, and no one cared to rise. The meal was over, and all heads were bowed, and hands were folded under the table. In a general way, few ever thought of saying grace, but now they sat for some time thus, looking down. Cornelis Gomon, that merry fellow! Could he be lying in the West Fjord now? When at last they raised their heads, they still sat looking straight before them. At last Henry Rabben spoke. "It won't be easy for his father," he said. And there was a low murmur of sympathy from the others. The very next day, the fishing fleet sailed out to the banks again, but here and there a man was left standing on the shore, looking at the others as they sailed away, but with no longer a boat of his own. Kristover was one of these, and he and his men wandered about the islands in their Sunday clothes, with nothing in the world to do. They might as well make up their minds to take the steamer south and go home. There was no use in putting it off. for there was nothing more for them to do here this year. There were still some boats that had not returned after the storm, and men were standing about, gazing out to sea, on the lookout for them. In the afternoon, Kristaver decided to row over to his friend, Edvin Hansen from Varanger. When anything troubled him, it always did him good to have a walk and a chat with the merry Nordlander. On his way, however, he heard news that affected him deeply. Edvin Hansen, with boat and crew, had gone down in the storm. His boat had been seen to fill and sink. For the rest of the day Kristaver walked about by himself, and in the hut in the evening he did not utter a word. He seemed to see Edvin's red, beardless face and beautiful smile, and to hear him talking of the 3 families he had to keep. "It's strange about a brother," he had said. "It's easier for the one that's alive to look after the widow than for the one that's dead. And some of the children have to lie under the kitchen dresser, but except for that it's all plain sailing." It was the greatest sorrow Kristaver had ever had. He began to wander about the islands as if in search of his friend. He rowed across to other islands and talked to people and tried to joke, but it was all nonsense. He went out to jutting points of land in order to be alone, and would sit chewing a quid and gazing at the sea and the gulls. And now he began to feel Cornelis haunting him and saying, "You let go of me, Kristaver. You were the head man, but at the last moment you saved yourself and let go of me." Edvin Hansen would have said, "Yes, but Kristaver only let go of you when Jakob sailed right over the keel, and there was nothing else to be done. Kristaver did all that could be done." "If it had been his son Lars," says Cornelis, with a laugh. Kristaver got up, shook himself, and set off walking. Where should he go? If he could have gone to Edvin now, that man would have managed to get rid of Cornelis and put him, Kristaver, in his right mind again. It did not matter now where he went. Cornelis went with him. They were having supper in the hut when Jakob came limping in. He first said, "May your food be blessed," and the others asked him to sit down and share it with them. Then he talked about the price to be got for fish and about all kinds of things, and at last he remarked that it was wonderful how lucky some people were. "Like Kristaver there, for instance," he added. "Like me, yes," said Kristaver, with a sullen glance at him. "Like you, yes. Do you know that your boat's been found by a steamer?" There was a general movement of surprise, and they all turned toward the speaker. Kristaver forgot the food in his mouth and sat staring at Jakob. "I suppose that's a joke," he said at last. "No, damn it all, if your boat isn't lying in the channel here, I've seen her myself. It was a salt steamer from Kristiansund that fished her up, and as her number was still hanging on, it was easy enough to know where she was from. Oh yes, you're a lucky one, you are." "You must have a dram for that piece of news," said Peter Susansa. It eased his mind too, for he had felt as if he could not look Kristaver in the face. He had not yet brought himself to the point of asking who his rescuer had been, but he knew from other sources that it was Jakob. Damn it all with a limp was not the man, however, to go about boasting of what he had done. It was an easy matter for Kristaver to prove that the boat that had been found was his, and before long he was standing looking at the seal as she lay there, bare of all her rigging and white with frost and frozen spray. It was like meeting again with an old friend. A few days later he went to the shop and bought a mast and a sail, ropes and nets. His pocketbook became thinner. The notes crackled when he unfolded them and paid with them, but the man behind the counter found them quite satisfactory. When Kristaver raised the new mast in the seal, he placed it 4 inches farther aft than it had been before, and put a block of wood between it and the knee piece. For at the moment the boat capsized, the conviction had shot like lightning through his mind that it was there the fault lay. The want of unity between the rigging and the boat arose from the fact that the mast was too far forward. This was why the seal was capricious. This was why she had capsized 3 times before. But now he would show that, as he had up to the present been able to make her go, so he would be able to make her stand up. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 32. The spring had come. There was still frost at night and the snow was deep and high, but in the middle of the day the sun shone warm, so that bluebottles began buzzing about and crawling in and out of the eye sockets in the fish heads that were scattered about all over the islands. There was a stronger smell of sea, fish refuse and seaweed. The gardens of the station had a spring fragrance of their own. It was a great day for Kristofer when he was once more ready to set out for the banks in the Seal. It is useless to try to sail a staatsboat with only 4 men, and so he had been over to an island on which there was a fish guano factory and engaged a man who was a neighbor of his at home. His name was Elias Flata, and he was a bow-legged man of about 70, who was too old to fish, but still came up every winter to work in the factory, his work being to thread cod heads on strings. He sometimes returned home after a winter spent thus in Lofoten, with 70 or 80 kroner in his pocket. "What I want is a capable man," said Kristofer, to encourage the old man, "and I know of no one better than you." Elias Flata's face brightened. In his day he had been such a fine fellow and had done the work of 7, but old age. He scratched his ear doubtfully and said, "No, he was surely too old for that." "Oh, no," said Kristofer, still persisting. "No, if I can get you as you are, we 5 will be as good as 6 or 7 for that matter." It does old people good to hear younger men boasting. The old man gave in. He had no sea-going clothes, but there were Elesu's hylla, sea boots and oilskins that he could have. The Seal stood out to sea again, and the old man was once more on board a Lofoten boat. Ah, but he was a man who knew how things should be done in the forepart of the boat, where he was stationed. The very first day he was cuffing Arnt Åsan because he was such a clumsy fellow. They sailed out with a fair breeze and the North Sea rocking under them, and once more saw the countless boats at their peaceful occupation and the clouds of birds in the air. The old man looked about him and could not help laughing. Ha ha! He had been out like this before now. On the way back they had to row against the wind, and he and Lars chanced to sit together on the same thwart, each with his oar. The seaman of 70 wanted to compete with the boy of 16, and they both pulled hard, neither of them wishing to be thought the weaker. How the old man rowed! "You must buck up, boy," he said, "and see who's the strongest. Pull away. Rowing's real medicine. There's scarcely an illness but what you can row yourself well of again." The very first evening he got Lars to put together a letter to his old woman down south. All he wanted to say was that he had gone to sea again. That would give the women folk something to talk about. About the middle of April the fishing began to draw to an end, and one day when they were out on the banks, with the sun shining and a light breeze ruffling the surface of the water, several heads were raised to watch a flock of black birds flying westward. "The cormorant's moving," the men said to one another, with a laugh. It was a sign, for when the birds departed from Varøy and Røst, the fishing was ending here and beginning out west. Another bright sunny day, when a wind was blowing that would be splendid for anyone going south. A boat that had come out later than the others brought the news that several Southerners at the station were making ready to start. They had put the cabin in, and some had the high rigging up in readiness for the voyage home. While the nets were being drawn, someone shouted, "Why, there are some brown cormorants on the move!" There was a pause in the work while all eyes gazed across the water at 5 or 6 Nordland boats that were sailing over the West Fjord before a fresh breeze. They must be men from Helgeland, and now they were going. The first birds of passage had risen and flown south. A peculiar restlessness spread from boat to boat on the banks. The men pulled and tugged at their nets, their one desire being to go ashore and follow their example. The fishing was over for this year, and they wanted to go home. Suddenly a Statsboat with a topsail was seen coming on alone after the others over the West Fjord. "Who can that be?" asked one and another, wonderingly. "Damn it all, if it isn't Andreas Ekra!" cried Jakob. "Upon my word, he has stolen a march upon us this year too." The Southerners gazed for a few moments at this comrade boat that was again playing them this trick. Oh, that Andreas! That Andreas! After this, no time was lost. The nets were dragged in, the oars shipped, and a race began between hundreds of boats, all wanting to reach land and be the first to start for home. Old Elias Flata was one who pulled hard, and if he had any illnesses, he would certainly have rowed himself into health again now. It was a busy night, for there was much to settle and do, but by the morning most of the boats were ready, the cabin in the stern and the high rigging up. Goodbye, goodbye! Nordlanders and Southerners waved their southwesters to one another and hastened out to sea. Silence had descended upon the islands. There were no boats in the harbour, and no sounds arose from the wharves. The gulls had made their entry, however, and soared above the islands on white, sun-flecked wings, to swoop down upon the shining water and dive for refuse. The huts about which the fishermen had lately thronged were now deserted, and their windows, grey with salt spray, looked out from empty rooms whose occupants had forgotten in their haste to wash the floor, and where a sooty coffee kettle and a black stew pan had been left standing unemptied, and would have to wait there for 9 months before men came to the hut again. A girl was standing on a point of rock with her hands on her hips, gazing after one particular boat. The wind ruffled her hair, her breathing was quick and heavy. She saw steamers bustling out, sloops and trading vessels hoisting sail, lister boats heeling over to leeward and darting off. Sails, sails everywhere, and all hastening away to far, far distant shores. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 33. How blue the West Fjord can be, and its waves frolic in sunshine and wind like children playing leapfrog and shouting with delight. How warm the air on the cheek, although it is only April, and the snow is lying 6 feet deep in fjords and valleys. The fleet of sails dispersed in all directions, some sailing out through the sounds toward the Vesterålen Islands, and others toward the northeast, where they tacked in within the belt of islands past Harstad and Ibbestad, and farther north up the endlessly long coast of Finnmark. Those who were going east toward the mainland or farther south sailed away before a fair wind, such as one would like when racing. The Stadsboats differed from the others in having a topsail above the high square sail, and at the top of the mast a red pennon that fluttered in the wind.
All along the Lofoten wall, stretching westward in the golden sunshine, white sails were moving, looking smaller and smaller the more distant the station from which they sailed out. Those from Ballstad, Sørvågen, and Gloppen looked like mere dots beneath the sunny sky. Across the blue West Fjord they sailed, all filled with a longing for home, a suddenly awakened longing for spring and sunshine, for green grass and budding woods, for some little cottages on headlands and up fjords in the south, farther and farther south for hundreds and hundreds of miles. Those that were friends tried still to keep together. Andreas Ekra indeed had stolen a march on them, but the Seaflower cleft the waves just to leeward of the Seal, and Peter Susansa was a few boat lengths to windward. The three headmen often looked westward over the sea as they thought of a comrade's boat with striped sail that had rowed out from Stamsund that winter. They did not now take the shortest way across the West Fjord, so as to gain the shelter on the mainland, for the days were long and bright. They steered in an oblique line for a snowy peak that glowed in the sunshine, only just visible on the southeastern horizon. It was Lannegod, and they meant to sail the 150 miles of sea to it before night. There were boats in front, behind, and on all sides, rising and falling on the gentle swell of this wide blue plain. The brown boats, with their bellying sails, rode upon the waves and let themselves be carried along through the light and foam, but at last the wave could not spare any more time and rolled on, leaving the boat to follow with the next wave. The Nordland boat, with its fine lines and broad tanned sail, flew lightly along, while the headman sat with a tiller to windward and was on good terms with the wind and the weather. A heavy sloop with square stern was in the throng, panting along with its cheeks puffed out like a heavily laden market woman. Pff! Wait a little, good people! For 100 years these same sloops carried a black patch on their sail in memory of the poet of the north, and they still seem to stagger along with mourning on board. Farther off a pointed lister boat cut through the water, vexed at not being in front of the others, and a little to leeward a black galleass plunged along with a confusion of grey three-cornered sails in her rigging. The north wind freshened, and it became easy to see which boats were in their element on the sea. Wind and open sea do for some, but not for all. It takes a good deal to make the headman of a statsboat lower his topsail when he is on his way south. The boat is heavy and steady from having lain so long in the water, and there are a good many barrels of liver in the cargo. The boat can do with plenty of sail. The headman stood with the warm light reflected from the sea upon his face, swinging the tiller backward and forward above his head. He was in a good temper today, for he was on a voyage again, on his way toward something pleasant that was awaiting him far beyond those rosy clouds that he could see on the horizon, and he had a good wind. The boat, too, was something more than a boat. She had come sailing out from long distant ages. She had once been a Viking ship, and even now the headman standing there was not a fisherman but a chieftain. The water foamed about her bow and rushed in white streams along her sides. This was what a wind should be. There are many ways of sailing, and now the men felt that pleasant thrill all through their bodies, and they looked at one another and laughed. Kristaver's face was beaming. The Seal was like a new boat. She had her cargo and her mast as she liked them. She had to come out with it at last, and now she could bear all the sail Kristaver considered he could put upon her. There was now harmony between rigging, hull, and sails, as if they had sung themselves together in wind and wave, and he now stood listening to the song of the boat and her rigging in the fresh wind. Some gulls from the islands had been following them all this time, but now they turned. "Au! Au! A pleasant voyage and a speedy return." And they flew back over the green-blue water in the direction of a far-off row of white rocks standing up in the middle of the sea. It was the Lofoten wall, already left far behind, with its snowy peaks glowing in the golden sunshine. The men took a farewell look. They had all gone through experiences of one kind or another during these winter months. Peter Susansa turned his head several times. For 50 years he had come up every winter for the fishing, and this would be the last time. He would never come again. There was a considerable difference in the contents of the various headmen's pocketbooks. They had all made a good deal by the fishing at one time or another, but not a few had been unfortunate and lost their nets once or even oftener, so that in the end their gains did little more than cover their losses. And if they had a few banknotes, large or small, when they reached home, there were holes enough there for them to stop up. But what did it matter? They were on their way home. Each man stood in his place on board, with his legs apart, careless of the spray that dashed into his face. They looked at the green, seething water, with its white horses riding out into the red sunset sky in the west, on which rose a belt of gold-edged clouds, making a wonderful paradise into which to gaze. The wind blew stronger, and a seething wall of green water and foam rose on each side of the boat. Ha! Ha! They looked at one another again. This was something like sailing. Far down in the southeast, land appeared on the horizon, a coast with a long, irregular line of white-topped mountains that had a rosy tinge under the clear, cloudless sky. The Sea-Flower drew in toward the seal, and Jacob shouted that they would really be in much too early, for the 150 miles were nothing with such a wind. What would the others say to changing their course and setting it a few miles farther south, perhaps to Kunna? It was a pleasure sailing in such weather. Kristaver's answer was a good-humoured smile, and so the Sea-Flower set the new course, and the others followed. If this weather continued, they would do the 700 miles in 4 days. Damn it all with the limp was most eager to get home this year, not because there would be anyone standing on the beach to welcome him, but because his great wealth had shrunk so much during the last week or two up at the station. Cornelis had taken a good lump with him to the bottom of the West Fjord, and the station king had taken many large notes from him because he had guaranteed for several of those who were lost in the storm. What of that? It was not exactly amusing to be a king one day and a beggar the next, but it was at least a consolation to be on the way home. Home? Why, certainly he was going home. And so he stood at the helm, his weather-beaten face wreathed in smiles, and every now and then hummed to himself, "Oh dear, Maria, oh ho!" Late that evening they passed the beacon light outside Kunna, and the next day they continued their voyage with the same fair wind. There was a fleet of square-sailed boats thronging through the sounds, between small islands and rocks that hid them from one another, so that only a topsail and a pennon could be seen flying along on the other side. Then they came into open water again. The number of Nordland boats became smaller and smaller as they kept turning in along the Helgeland shore to their homes, and here their southern boundary was reached. The days grew brighter and the sun's rays hotter, and soon there were only Stadsboats sailing southward along the grey coast. The waves rolled in toward the long wall of mountains that towered into the sky, and the heat of the sun caused masses of snow to loosen from their sides and fall with a noise like thunder into the sea. But this time everything was bright and clear. The islands were washed by the waves until they shone. The seabirds floated on the water and uttered glad cries. It was the mating season, and soon the females would walk up the rock to lay their eggs behind some convenient stone. The snowy mountain tops were no longer hidden in sea mist. They were bathed in light and turned crimson in the sunset glow. It was as though land and sea were already adorning themselves for the summer with its hot, endless days and its crimson flaming night skies. The boats sailed past a patch of cultivated ground in a mountain cleft where the sheep were out already, and the scent of the damp earth made the fishermen's nostrils quiver and awakened hopes of real spring when they reached home, with the cuckoo calling in the woods and the starling whistling on the roof. Now the men in the off-fjord boats were waving their southwesters. "Goodbye!" They turned into their fjord, the first Scotsmen to reach home. Weather-beaten men in heavy sea boots went into cottages along the beach in there, carrying with them an odor of salt sea and of tar. Welcome home! And no sooner did a man sit down than he felt two little arms thrown around his neck. The boats that were going still farther south met a flying triangle high up in the sky, going north. "Gak, gak," it said. "Tastes differ." The grey goose had grown homesick for some desolate shore on the Arctic Ocean, far, far north. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 34. The snow had thawed early in the fjord that year. In the lowlands the fields were already being harrowed, and women might often be seen upon the beach, shading their eyes with their hands and looking down the fjord for the glimpse of a sail. No one could see past Blue Hill, however, and so the children were sent up the rocks, for there they could see a long way right out to the blue sea. No one had received any tidings, no one knew anything definite, but it was the time when the Lofoten men might be expected. One wife rubbed her nose and said that Ola would be home soon because her nose itched. Another said she had had such a lifelike dream that they were coming, and a third felt it in her bones. To make sure of being ready in time, they began scrubbing and cleaning the little cottages, chopping up juniper twigs with which to strew the floor, and putting clean sheets on the beds. And it would not be amiss either to give a little cleaning to oneself, for perhaps it had not been done quite lately. Even Andreas Ekra's wife, Anna Marta, clambered down from her loom and said, "Damn!" and began a thorough cleaning. She had, it was true, sworn that she would make up a bed for Andreas in the cowshed when he came back, because he never sent her a line from Lofoten all the winter. But the sun was shining so brightly, and the magpie and the starling were chattering around the house and building their nests, and all that sort of thing is infectious. Anna Marta bustled about and swore that those who had common sense should use it. It was quite likely that Andreas had not been very warm and dry this winter either. And when the cottage was ready and the bed made up, she went along the beach, like the others, to look down the fjord and wait. Up in a little red-painted cottage, pretty Berit Hylla was sweeping and scrubbing, and had never been busier in her life. Her husband's coffin had come home during the winter, and he was laid in the churchyard. One thing was certain, and that was that he would never beat her again. But now, when the other wives were cleaning and tidying and expecting their husbands, she involuntarily began to do the same. When the house was clean and tidy both outside and in, she washed the children and dressed them in their Sunday clothes, and sat down for a few minutes to talk to them about their father. She could not, of course, be expecting in the same way that the others were, but nevertheless, when she saw the neighbors' children come flying down the hill, all trying to be first, she knew that they must have seen sails far down the fjord, and the next moment she had begun to make herself tidy. She scrubbed herself thoroughly, and then, standing in the sunshine, let down her thick, red-gold hair, plaited it, and twisted it into a knot low down at the back of her head. When this was done, she put on a clean chemise and a red petticoat, and over all a dress of blue home-woven material, and then seated herself at the window with her youngest child on her lap to watch, she too, for sails. Old Ola Gomon, at the little farm up among the hills, had become very infirm of late. Things did not always go well when one could no longer see well enough to be able to work, and he would sit all day by the stove, constantly replenishing it and gazing into the flames. He had now quite made up his mind that when Cornelis came back from Lofoten he would speak seriously to him and tell him he must get married. If he would go to the fisheries, he must, at any rate, see that there was a grown-up woman in the house. And besides, it would be a good thing if the children came while he, the old man, was able to rock the cradle. Rock the cradle, yes. Many an evening this winter he had sat gazing into the stove, humming to himself and saying, "Hush, hush." The snow still lay deep up on the hills, but one day a starling stood whistling upon the roof. This roused the old man. "A starling," he said. "Then the Lofoten men must be on their way home." He groped his way to the door. The sun was shining and the yews were dripping. He made his way to the big birch tree that stood at the corner of the house and felt that there was sap in its bark. "Lina," he called to the girl as she came from the cowshed. "Go and see if there are any Lofoten sails on the fjord." "Very well, father, but—" "Now, just go at once." The pale young girl took what she was carrying into the house and then went up the hill. Her father knew well that Cornelis would not be coming, for the priest had been up some time ago and told them so as gently as he could, but the old man's mind was failing and he had forgotten it already. Occasionally an uneasy feeling would take possession of him, and he would gaze at her in fear and ask if it were true or only a bad dream, for he had dreamed something dreadful about Cornelis in the night. And then he would dismiss it from his thoughts and feel for his pipe. No, he was quite determined that Cornelis should marry, and marry soon, too. A day or two later he insisted on going up on the hill where he had stood many a time when he still had his eyesight and gazed out toward the sea. His daughter only made him angry by refusing to take him, and so she led him past the worst snowdrifts and found a good place on a rocky knoll for him to stand. The wind blew through his long white hair and beard as he stood. He wore a faded red-pointed woolen cap on his head, and upon his back his braces were crossed over a thick knitted woolen vest. The weather was so warm that he did not even need a waistcoat. The young girl standing beside him, bareheaded, was thin and pale from her lonely life with too much work and from sorrow for the brother whom she would never see again. She looked at the fjord far below, between lowlands and mountains, broad and blue in the north wind and the sunshine. Far out toward the sea rose bare mountains, with the snow upon their long undulating ridges looking yellow and red in the sunshine. When she turned, she saw the same fjord in another direction, and here it was gradually merged in a yellowish mist. Far within it lay the town that she longed to see some day. "Do you see any boats?" asked the old man as he shaded his eyes with his hand from long habit and looked in the right direction. "Yes. No, it's a steamer, and then there is a ship, but I don't see any Lofoten boats." "Ah!" The old man grew irritable. "They can't be far off now. You must look more carefully." "Yes, but you'd better come home with me now, father. We can come up here another time." "No, we'll wait a little longer. But you'll have the house to tidy up, and I suppose you've got a clean shirt for Cornelis?" "Oh, yes, but—" The girl turned and moved away a little. "What are you crying for, girl? Are you ill?" "Oh, no, father." She dried her eyes well enough for her to see the fjord again, and suddenly began to gaze intently. Far out a sail had come into sight, A tall square sail, and there was another. One was white, and the other was tanned. And there came yet another. They were coming up the fjord with the in-fjord wind. Still more appeared, a number altogether, and now there was no doubt as to their being Lofoten boats. She made an exclamation. "What is it? Can you see anything?" "Yes, now! They're coming now!" "No, really? Are they really coming? Can you see them plainly?" "Yes, they're coming now." "Ha, ha! Yes, of course. There they come." And the old man shaded his eyes with his hand and gazed, too, but it was only recollections of former days that he saw. He had stood here many a time when his sight had been different from what it was now, and he could see the blue fjord and all the bright sails, and Cornelis was on one of those boats. It was all a memory, but to him it was as clear as daylight. "They won't take long now to come up the fjord," he said, "with such a wind. Hurry up and get the house made straight, girl. And you must make yourself tidy, and I expect I need a good wash too. Come along, we must hurry." The young girl did not dare to oppose him, and she felt she could not remind him of what he knew as well as she did. He was getting old. So she tidied the house and then attended to her father, who declared he would put on his Sunday clothes. If only he had not taken it into his head that he would go down to the shore to meet Cornelis. He made her harness the little dun fjord horse that had been in the stable all the winter, because there had been no one to use it. They had meant to sell it in the autumn, but Cornelis had been fond of it. She gave in to her father at last, for there would be no harm in meeting the other men and hearing what they had to tell about her brother, and besides they would have brought his chest with them and perhaps some clothes. The ragged little horse was almost blinded by the light when it emerged from the dark stable. She harnessed it to the sledge, however, and then, dressed in a cloak that had been her mother's and with 2 thin yellow plaits hanging down her back, drove down the hills, her father sitting with his back to the horse, holding on. When they reached the lowlands, they had to leave the sledge and borrow a cart. People looked after them as they drove along. They guessed where the old man was going. The same bright, mild weather continued, and people were watching from more than 20 cottages along the shore when the first boat came round the headland. Strange to say, Andreas Ekra had not arrived yet, but God's ways are wonderful. At Folla, a wave had beaten in his waterboard, and he had to go ashore and patch it up. So everyone understood that it had been so ordained by Providence in order that he should not arrive before the others. Several sails appeared, making straight up the fjord for the districts higher up, but one turned in. It was the Seafire, Peter Susansa's boat, and as the first Lofoten boat came over the bay, it seemed to the people standing on the beach that she had come on a visit to them all. The next was Andreas Ekra on the Stormbird. People recognized the boat and said that was Andreas. He drew in the sheet and rounded the headland so close-hauled that the water foamed around him. Then came another, the Seal, and as she had to go in farthest she made a wider turn with well-filled sails and the spray dashing from her bows. And last of all came one with tanned sails, making so sharp a turn that the water seethed around her. This was the Sea Flower. Every one was walking or running down from the cottages, the children flying past the old folk, hobbling along with sticks. The beach round the grey boathouses was black with people when the boats turned, the sails were lowered, the grapnel splashed into the sea, and the first small boat came rowing in to land. To a man who had been away for a long time and was now rowing in toward it, the beach was like an old friend. The sand was washed by the sea and dried by the sun and the wind, and at the top of the slope, nearest the grass, lay a line of brown seaweed. As Kristaver stepped out upon the sand, he was met by his old mother. It was not the first time she had welcomed her son home, but every time it was as if he came as a gift from God and from the sea. The weather-beaten man would have shaken hands with her, but the child was already hanging on to each of his hands, and he walked up the beach with them. He had seen Maria with the youngest child on her arm up by the boathouse, and supposed she did not want to push herself forward, but she was the principal person for him today. She was looking at him with frightened eyes. He had come back to her once more, but what was the good of that if he was going away again next winter? This was only like a visit. Kristofer's face was all smiles. So much had happened since they had parted, and he would have liked to put his arms around her and tell her that it was splendid of her to manage everything so well while he was away, but there were so many people about. "Good day," was all he said, adding, "You've come down with all the family." "Yes, good day," she replied with a smile. "Welcome home." "Thank you," he said, and tried to take the baby's tiny hand in his. How big and rough his hand looked beside the little white baby hand. "I believe you're afraid of your own father," Kristofer said. "Have you forgotten me?" "Yes, he really has." And he laughed as the child screamed and clung to his mother's neck. Lars had to go back with the boat to fetch the others. He had imagined that he would be the center of this homecoming, and after all he was nothing. It was father, nothing but father, all the time. And as to Oluf, why, he had come and pretended that they two were equals. But the boy would have to understand that in the future he must give way in everything to his elder brother, who was a Lofoten man. Henry Rabben's tall, pretty wife wore a black dress with a bright-colored kerchief on her head, and when Henry came toward her, he was overcome with shyness at the sight of her beauty. Gurina Åsan had brought a can of coffee for Arndt, and she at once took him behind the boathouse so he could have something hot to drink. There was no embrace, no shaking of hands. The two simply stood looking at one another from a little distance, and then smiled and tried to say something commonplace. "You're out in this fine weather, are you?" he said, and she replied by saying, "Yes, and you're sailing?" Perhaps their breath came a little more quickly than usual, and there was a peculiar brightness in their faces. A whole winter had passed, and they had gone through experiences of one kind and another, both she who had been left at home and he who had been away. There was an old toothless woman waiting too, the wife of Elias Flata, whom Kristofer had taken on for the last of their time up north. The bow-legged old man of 70 wanted to show off to his old woman, and trudged about the beach in XXXIII's sea boots, and found all manner of things to see to. Surely the old woman did not suppose that he had time to stand shaking hands and saying good day and welcome home. He was a Lofoten man again, and had to look after everything. While the people were still standing about, 2 children came running down a path, followed by a woman who called to them to come back and go home. The children, however, were determined to go down to the beach, like all the others, and now people saw that they were XXXIII's children, a boy and a little girl of 5 or 6. They were down before their mother could catch them, and Berit herself, almost without knowing how she came there, found herself in the midst of the throng. "Anna, Peter, come with me now," she called in despair. A silence fell upon those standing near her, and they all looked at the children. Berit raised her head, and her glance passed from one to another until it rested upon the headman, as if there were something she wanted to ask him about. People forgot what they were doing to look at this pretty young woman with the golden hair, and when the little girl asked, "Where's father?" a thrill passed through them. At last the old woman from Myran went up to her and said, "Poor little thing, your father'll be coming soon." And their mother, holding a child by the hand on each side of her, began to retrace her steps. On seeing this, Kristover followed her, and when she turned he held out his hand. A solemn silence fell on all around, and they heard him say, "Well, well, Berit, things'll all come right, you'll see." The tears came into her eyes, but she only asked if they had Eleseus's provision chest with them, and Lars, who then came up, promised to wheel it out to her sometime that evening. As she went slowly up the path with the 2 children, many a gaze followed her, but she did not look back. Busy youngsters were occupied in carrying things up from the boat. It was no easy matter to drag along father's leather trousers or oilskin coat. Just as they were about to separate and go home, a cart drawn by a small horse came down the road. A young girl was sitting in front, driving, and behind sat an old man with white hair and beard, holding on tightly. The girl's face wore a faint smile, as if in apology for coming. They stopped, and the girl got down and held the horse's head, while the old man clambered down from the cart. Considering what her father was like, the girl could see now what a mistake it was for them to have come. "Is that you, Ola?" said Kristover, going up to the old man, but his features were drawn as if with pain, and he was as pale as it was possible for a weather-beaten fisherman to be. He stood before the father of the man of whom he had let go that night they were shipwrecked on the West Fjord. The old half-blind man was now wearing his broad-brimmed black church hat. His coat of homespun was quite short, and had silver buttons both in front and behind. He came straight up to Kristover, with his stick in his hand. "Good day," he said, cheerfully. "So here you are, then. It is you, I suppose, Kristover? Ah, well, it's not the first winter you've sailed, is it?" He stopped and leaned upon his stick. "Well, well, but where's Cornelis?" No one replied, and from where the horse was standing a girl's voice was heard calling, "Father, father, come here!" The old man looked round. "Come here," he said, imitating her. "Aren't you able to hold that little horse, a strong girl like you?" And he turned to Kristover again. "Yes, what's become of Cornelis? Hasn't he come ashore yet?" He waited for a little while and then went on again. "He surely hasn't got hold of a woman already, has he? But they're always running after that boy. But what's he like at sea? He's a good seaman, isn't he?" 1 or 2 women sighed and slipped away, and gradually the sight of this old man with the red-rimmed, half-blind eyes, standing and asking after his son, made them all silent and anxious to slink away. "Cornelis, yes," said Kristover at length, looking down at the sand, but he bit his lip and got no further. "Aren't you here then, boy?" The old man became impatient and began looking round him and calling, "Cornelis!" Then, turning in the direction in which he supposed the boat lay, he called more loudly, "Cornelis, are you still on board?" There was no answer, but then Kristover's mother went up to the old man. "Poor Ola," she said, "have you forgotten what the priest came and told you?" The old man passed his hand over his eyes. "The priest," he said. Yes. I seem to have dreamed something about... Is it true that Cornelis was drowned? You're the head man, Kristover. You must know all about it. What's become of Cornelis?" "Father!" cried the young girl once more. "Father, come here!" "Yes, Cornelis was drowned," said Kristover sadly. "We thought you knew about it." The old man tried to collect his thoughts and to see from the faces of those he was speaking to what this really meant. He rubbed his eyes and strove to rouse recollection, and blurred memories of a bad dream returned. But was it anything more than a dream about Cornelis? Was it true? Well, Well, he said at last, looking up and holding on to his hat as if he had been in a wind. Well, well, so that's how it is. It was the greatest effort XXXIV could ever remember having to make when he took the old man's hand and said, as he pressed it, "It was God's will, Ola, and if there is anything we can help you with now, you can rely upon us." That's how it is then. Well, well. And he turned to his daughter again. "Lina, we may as well go back. Cornelis won't be coming with us." The few people now remaining separated and went to their respective cottages. XXXIV walked with heavy steps, and yet, that cottage was his home. The young girl and her old father drove away through the lowland district. They had Cornelis's chest with them, and a bundle of clothes upon which the old man sat, with his back to the horse, holding on with both hands. He had already forgotten what had taken place down on the beach, and recollections from previous years were all that remained in his mind. Every now and then as they went up a hill he would say, "Aren't we soon on the flat, Lina, so that Cornelis can get up?" Farther on they had to exchange the cart for the sledge again, and they then drove on up the hills in the blue twilight. The old man chattered all the time about Cornelis. "I'll say it to him this very evening," he said. "He must get married now while I'm still able to look after the children a little. Oh yes, I can see well enough to rock a cradle." The little horse was pulling sturdily up the hills, and the young girl, sitting behind it in her mother's cloak, holding the reins, was thinking what good friends Dunny and Cornelis had been, and that she would give the horse an extra good feed when they reached home. The wide blue fjord sank lower and lower as they climbed, and the white ridges of the West Mountains grew rosy red in the glow of the sunset. On the waters of the bay, not far from land, lay the stately Lofoten boats, with their white sheer strakes, high rigging, and red pennants. They had returned from a long voyage, and now lay there peacefully, as if after a battle. There was still a man on board the Seaflower, and it was the headman himself, Jacob. He was rummaging about in the cabin, making himself tidy. He washed his face in a bucket of sea-water and dried it on an old blouse, and then combed his thick hair and beard with his fingers. The shaggy sea-bear was making himself spruce, and tomorrow perhaps he would go to the length of shaving his upper lip. The kettle was sputtering on the little stove, and he meant, when he had had a good meal of salt pork, bread, and sausage, to make himself a coffee doctor and smoke a pipe of shag. Things of this sort never taste so well as when you've just come home. Tomorrow he would go to bed and sleep for a week, and then he would go to town and sell his cod liver and go on a spree. If he got away from that with the whole skin, he would sail back again, beach the Seaflower, and clean and paint her so that she would look like a bride, after which he would creep into the cabin to sleep until the following winter, when he could set out on a new Lofoten voyage. That was his life. Home? Well, had he not sailed his hardest all those miles, and then there was not a soul to meet him on the beach and bid him welcome? Perhaps not, but home is a strange thing. The men that had gone to their cottages to wives and children would be washed by women's hands and have good food and a soft bed. That was the way they liked to have things. But Jacob was no worse off in his way than they. When his meal was finished, he went out and sat on a thwart with his pipe and his coffee doctor, looking landward. It was beautiful in the bay now. The black cock was courting in the woods, the moon was scattering silver gleams upon the water, and the lights in the cottage windows blinked at him. There was a headland on each side of the bay, and they had been his friends ever since he was a boy, and now he could sit here and look at them once more. Home, the two headlands said to him. Welcome home, Jacob. When the snow is melting on the hills, a brook generally begins to run up in the glen. There it is. He can hear the same trickling that he has often heard before. Home, it says. Later, when it is quite dark, with only the moon shining, the waves too begin to croon and sing upon the beach. Home, they say, and make a little song about it, and he sits and listens to it. Yes, it is wonderful how everything seems to know that this evening Jakob has come home at last. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 35. One winter not long after, Lars was reading hard for his examinations at the teachers' college. It was as though he was trying with work to escape from thoughts that troubled him a little. Oluf was now with his father in Lofoten, while he himself sat here, warm and comfortable. His father and Henry Rabben had guaranteed for him at the bank, so that he could come to the college. He accepted help from the fishermen and went on his way, and his only comfort was that he would be their spokesman when once he had come so far. He had had a Lofoten letter from Oluf that day. Stormy weather, bad fishing. Oluf had made up his mind to leave the sea and go to America in the spring. And father, thought Lars. His father would be too proud to oppose Oluf. He would even help him with money for his passage to America, but what would his own secret feeling be about it? Mother draws us to land, one after the other. He sat with his book before him, thinking over this strange conflict between his father and his mother. His father could be so strong and authoritative, but he always let her get the victory. And the pale, frightened-looking woman, who was half beside herself every winter and yet managed everything and worked so well, took from him one son after another, although she knew how much he needed them. And he, why, his face always brightened when he spoke to her, and he thought her perfect. Lars bent over his book and began reading again. He must get rid of these thoughts about his father. The following winter, Kristaver sailed to Lofoten with no son on board. Oluf was in America, and Torsten was not old enough. No one ever imagined that this strong man with the easy walk and bright nature went through dark hours in which he would have liked to hide himself from everyone. This was especially on their way north, the last night at Grøttøy, before crossing the West Fjord, when he could not sleep. It was not that, like any of the others, he might tomorrow have to stand in the presence of God. There was something worse than that for him. Cornelis Gomon might appear to him. You let go of me, but you saved yourself. If he could only find out without doubt whether it had been humanly possible for him to hold Cornelis a minute longer, for if it had been, he would probably be alive now. And tomorrow he had to cross the West Fjord. Some men thought he sailed more madly than before. They said he sailed like an idiot. But it was just that in stormy weather he saw Cornelis, and he reasoned that if he were guilty, he would not escape in any case. He sailed madly, but he sailed like a man. Lars became a teacher in an inland parish far from the sea. He was restless and excitable, and had 1,000 irons in the fire, now a lecture, now young people's clubs, and now libraries. Like his mother, he could never sit still, but the fact was that he was not happy so far from the sea. He often caught himself longing for a wild sail over foaming billows, especially if his father stood at the helm, like a sea god. This had to be got rid of by reading. It was a new way of rowing. He wanted to advance, fresh examinations, higher up. He had some experience of what it was to keep on rowing if there was some place you wanted to reach. A letter came from his mother in a small, unformed hand to say that his father had died in Lofoten. He had long gone with a sore upon his thigh, to which he paid no heed, and one day it grew very bad, and he had died in hospital. Lars went home, and for the first time for many years saw the little houses buried in snow. His father, like Eleseus Hylla, had come south in his coffin. He was lying in the barn, and Lars and his mother had gone up there together in the cold and lifted the lid off. Kristofer lay in a white shirt, with his hands folded upon his breast. His fair hair was still curly, but his short beard had begun to turn grey. Lars, with the knowledge acquired by study, was now able to appreciate the masculine beauty of this head. His brow had become lined, perhaps from sorrows that his sons may have occasioned him, but now he looked happy again, as if he could see Maria, even though his eyes were closed. But to Lars those closed eyes seemed to say, "Have you become a gentleman now, Lars?" Thorsten, the third son, was then 17 and had already been out 2 winters with his father, and this spring he stood on the headman's thwart and sailed the Seal home from Lofoten. His mother drew him to land too, however. That same spring they sold the boats and fishing gear and the Muir buildings, and then came her great day. She moved inland. Kristofer's mother had died some years before, and Maria had only her 4 children with her when at last she turned her back on the sea. She led the bell cow herself, while Thorsten sat on the top of the furniture load and drove, and the other children kept the sheep together. At last they were turning their backs on the sea. Maria walked quickly. She never noticed that the others often turned and looked back. There was a smell of spring by the sea, a smell of wet sand, of seaweed, of fish, but when they had passed Lindegård, the air held the fragrance of leafage, of fields, of flowers. Then they came to the valley, with its wooded sides and rushing river, where the sun shone and the air was heavy with the fragrance of bird cherry and pine. Ah, what a day! Mountains stood shelteringly on the north and west. The wild winter storms could not reach this. The evil years were past. "Are you crying, Mother?" asked the youngest boy. "Oh, I can easily laugh," she answered, drying her eyes and laughing. The cow she was leading was old. It was Russia, with her white head and fine horns tipped with brass buttons. She was 15 years old, but Maria had never been willing to part with her. She walked slowly, but a little way up the valley she raised her head and began to snuff the air, recalling the summer pasture up here where she had grazed so many summers, and she quickened her pace as well as she could. At last they came to the little farm, consisting of 2 grey buildings, dwelling house and cowshed, on a patch of cultivated ground on a hillside. It was not far from Maria's old home, and she felt at home here at last. "But it's so dark here," whimpered Jonetta when they came into the house. "Little silly," said her mother. Later on the youngest boy said plaintively, "Isn't there any sea here, Mother?" And so their life in the new place began. For Maria the days passed happily. There was no wind, no anxiety, no waves breaking and keeping her awake. She folded her hands in the evening when she went to bed. At last she had found God again. When the winter came, however, Thorsten went about moodily. He was thinking how he might now have been headman on the Seal. He had to work as a day labourer at farms in order to earn a little money, but he was not a genius in farming. He was always in a dreamy condition, longing for the open sea and a regular storm, and he looked at his mother with angry eyes because she had persuaded him to leave the sea. They could cultivate their land, his mother said. Very well, but where was the money to do it with? He could not understand that there was money to be earned by digging in the earth. Money was to be made by a good fishing season, something good that comes suddenly, like a lottery. That was what his father thought. That was how it was on the sea. In the winter evenings, the children would sit round the stove and want to hear about their father, but their mother drew back, as it were, into the darkness and would not answer them. It was Torsten who told them about him, and Maria could see how their eyes were fixed upon him, and with what avidity they took in all that he told them. "Father, the sea, Lofoten, tell us more." The youngest boy played with a wooden shoe on the floor, the shoe being the seal, and the floor the West Fjord. Maria sighed. Kristaver was dead, but now it was his turn to draw the children toward him. Would he ever be able to drag them from her and out to sea again? She was determined that this should not be, and began to do all she could to entice them to her. She tried to make the house look nice, and toiled herself to save them from working as far as she could. If only she could teach them to be as happy here as she herself was. She would not confess, however, that she often lay awake at night listening vaguely for something. Was she beginning to miss the sound of the waves, the wind, the anxiety? Had she been as good to Kristaver as she should have been? Had she done wrong in selling Myran and the boats and all he had toiled for? Had she made the children homeless? The nights were long. Toward the end of the summer, she made a pretext for going down to the old home, which was now occupied by new people. As she stood looking out over the smooth, sunlit water, she wondered that she had never before seen how beautiful it was, nor understood how bright it made its surroundings, and that the waves are not always foaming angrily, but can also sing a crooning song, like the singing of a little child. She gazed and wondered, and as she went up through the valley again, she felt as if she had been to see Kristaver. She often afterward lay listening for the sound of the waves, and at last seemed to hear it distinctly, until it became a habit with her to conjure it up every evening when she folded her hands, and it became a song, a hymn, that she and Kristaver sang together. "Forgive me, Kristaver." She went down to the sea once more as a little pilgrimage to him, but she dared not take the younger children with her. The following winter, Torsten went to the town to earn a little money, but there he was even more dissatisfied than before, and at last went as a half-share man to Lofoten. Maria heard of it only after he got there. He might have been headman on the seal, and he was only a half-share man, and he did not think kindly of his mother. In the spring he wrote to her saying that the fishing had been bad, and that if he was to make any money to work the farm with, he must do something worth doing, and so he was going to America. He did not even come home first. Perhaps he did not think it was a home any longer. Perhaps not, thought Maria, and her back became more bent. They were hard times for those left on the little farm, and at night Maria would sometimes listen for the sound of the waves and pray, with folded hands, "Forgive me, for Christ's sake." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 36. A well-dressed man came ashore from the steamer. He was getting on for 40, had fair curly hair, a short reddish beard and a moustache, and well-marked features. It was Lars Myran, now the headmaster of a school. He walked a little way along the water's edge, stopping every now and then to look about him. He breathed the familiar atmosphere of seawater, seaweed, and tar. The fishermen's cottages were still standing around the bay, but most of them were now painted either red or white. A new generation had come to them, and times were quite changed. There was not a sail to be seen on the fjord. There were steamers, and the donk, donk of motorboats could be heard. The grey boathouses were still standing, but no Lofoten boats protruded from them, and no sailing vessels were anchored near the shore. The day of sailing boats had gone by. The Lofoten voyage of hundreds of miles was a thing of the past. The men who sailed them were dead or aged, and the boats were broken up. The modern motor fisherman is an industrial workman on the sea who smokes cigarettes and is a member of a trades union. Lars Myran sighed. And yet the neighborhood was the same. The fjord was the same. The West Mountains stood as they always did, with their snowy ridges. It was only the people that were different. Oh, yes. It is a strange thing to make a pilgrimage to one's childhood. It is not easy to find it again. His home was once in one of those cottages, and now strangers live there. And his mother, who moved up into the valley, was left there all alone one day, for the children went away, one after another. They never seemed to be able to settle there, though it was a nice little farm, and now she was dead, and the children were scattered all over the world. Time passes. Lars wandered on past the cottages. He was carrying a bag, but he knew of no place where he could obtain a night's lodging. What did it matter? Once he had been at home everywhere. "Good day," he said, stopping at a cottage where a woman was washing clothes. It was Ellen Koja, as she was once called. "Good day," she said, looking at him curiously. "Do you remember me, Ellen?" "No." She stared at him. Was it likely she would know a town man like this? "Don't you know that we two are man and wife? We were once married in a barn." "No! Well, I never!" she exclaimed, slapping her thigh and breaking into a laugh. "Is it really you, Lars? Oh, I beg your pardon. I oughtn't to be so familiar." She was still pretty, although she was a worn woman with 5 children. Her husband had once been a fisherman, but was now working in a factory in town. That was how it had gone with so many. They chatted together for a while, and then he went on, his mind filled with memories of former times. To make progress in one direction is to give things up in another. Such is life, and there is no help for it. At one of the boathouses he suddenly stopped. What was that? A long boat, turned keel upward, burned by the sun and weather-worn. It was a Lofoten boat. Lars walked round it and found a name on the bow, a few letters of which were just legible. The name was Seaflower. He stood still, with lips compressed. He remembered Jacob, damn it all with a limp. He had good reason for remembering him, and there lay the boat. He stood looking at it for a long time before he went on. He met various acquaintances with whom he chatted, and then caught sight of a very old man raking hay on a piece of ground below one of the cottages. His grey hair and beard were thick, and was it possible? He limped. Lars stopped again, and after looking intently at the old man, shouted, "Good day, Jacob." The old man looked up from his work and said, "Good day," and then went on raking. He was wearing a red, pointed cap, and his sunken eyes were bloodshot. "You're haymaking, are you?" said Lars. "That's so," said the old man. "And who may you be?" "Don't you know me either, Jacob?" "No." He looked the stranger up and down. "Well, if you hadn't saved me in a storm one night, I shouldn't be standing here now." "Is that so?" The old man laughed and considered, but he had saved so many. But when Lars told him who he was, he looked at him again, shading his eyes with his hand, and then exclaimed, "Damn it all, if I don't believe it's true! For you're the very image of your father, so it's you, is it, Lars?" "How old are you now, Jacob?" "Well, people say I'm over 90, but that's nothing when you're hale and hearty." "Are you boarded with someone now?" "Oh, yes, worse luck. I came upon the parish at last." "And you haven't sold the Sea-Flower, I see." "No, I thought we two should go to pieces together." And the old man began raking again. He would have to keep at it if there was to be any chance of a few pence for tobacco from the people with whom he was boarded. End of chapter 36. Recording by Kathrine Engan. End of The Last of the Vikings by Johan Bojer. Translated by Jessie Muir.